It is I! So yes, I promised that I would do a Way of the Witcher card review at some point to the stream, but that I wanted to wait for all the cards so that I would have full context and just keep it nice and simple, like one piece. Which probably means this will be stupidly long, knowing me, but oh well. That's my fault. I take full responsibility for this. Peppy smile. Let's go. So I guess we'll just go like in order. In order is like kind of weird, champ. I originally was okay. Actual quick detour. Originally, I was going to make a top 69 cards of Way of the Witcher, specifically so that I could exclude one. But that just fucking burned the shit out of me. So I'm not doing that format. It took way too long. It was way too fucking hard. And it was honestly just completely fucking pointless beyond the joke. So okay, with that aside, selective mutation, alchemy. Draw a card with adrenaline rush if you're. I'm not gonna read the fucking cards. That's gonna take way too long. This card. So this card looks really bad because it's a literal 4 for 6. However, this card, because it's a neutral card, is really deceptive. This card may as well have been printed as a Northern Realms card. If you actually turn the 2-point tokens on the 4 for 6 into 2 4-strength shielded dudes, this card is actually pretty legitimate. This card, unlike a lot of the other weird draw and shuffle effects, specifically tutors a card into your hand, and also plays for decent points. And I think the biggest thing about this card that some people don't realize is, unlike a lot of other engines, Griffin Witcher just has like very little cost to playing it. Like you have to play a single 4 for 4. Or the Griffin Witcher, the Griffin Witcher Adept has very little cost to playing it. You play a 4 for 4 once, and then you can enable like a whole bunch of these sorts of cards. So I actually think this card is quite strong in exactly that deck, and I think that deck is being underrated, though I will have more to say about that later. Maxi Van Decker. This card I think is currently trash. I don't really see the use for it. This card, if your deck is already in a quote-unquote like above average order, which is already a difficult thing to determine. It's already kind of difficult to squeeze value out of this card. You're literally playing a 6 for 6. If you decide you want to shuffle your deck, you can put a card on the bottom of it. You're not even rigging a card on the top. There's not really a way to play cards from the bottom currently in the game. If there was, maybe there would be some justification to this card existing. As is, it's trash. Berengar. Berengar is an okay vanilla. I think it'll most likely be played in Skellige just because of the playstyle of Skellige. In terms of like Skellige having a lot of really strong witchers that are also very sticky. And this card just being okay for the point, for the provs. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't make it even there. Just because 6 provisions is the pits of hell. It will depend on the exact provision distribution of that list. This will probably be an option, but not really good in that deck. In most decks, this card's kind of just filler trash. Leo, I briefly considered putting this in the Griffin Witcher deck that Selective Mutation belongs in, but I decided that you really need 7 Witchers for this to be like actually feel good playing at all. And that's a lot of Witchers. Like it really, even in that deck where you can spawn tokens and at least make like more than 1 Witcher per turn, it's still kind of a heavy requirement, and it feels like just one more combo piece than you need for not much reward. So I don't really think this card will see play. Triangle within a triangle, kind of a weird tech card. Is not a card you will ever want to play unless you want to use the first effect. But it definitely does gain some value by being able to be an emergency removal piece. How much value just kind of depends on what's in the meta, in terms of how many things will just die to it, like how well it can serve as sort of like a second proxy heat wave compared to like other things like Rock Slide or Curse. I don't really know what deck you actually want this in, because I feel like the only decks that would really get mileage out of the second effect are like the K-Controller Pily type decks. And the first effect is like terrible in those decks, and you can't guarantee that the second effect is actually good like ever. So really I just don't rate this card, but it's theoretically not the worst card ever, just because it has option value. Elzer easy. I mean, sure, you can play it on Elzer, but you don't actually want to play this on Elzer. It just makes it weaker to tall removal, and if you play this on Elzer, it survived a turn. So, like, why are you worried about damage removal? I think the best target for this card is Kelly, but again, it has the same problem. Like, if the Kelly survives, probably you don't actually necessarily want to boost the Kelly itself. Snowdrop. Snowdrop, if they actually printed real discard cards ever, could maybe not be shit. Snowdrop is shit. Yes, it works with Morvran immediately and can play 12 for 8. Morvran is shit. So Snowdrop is shit. The biggest problem with this card is that draw effects have diminishing returns. You don't actually, like, this 2 points per draw effect is not enough to make any of the draw effects actually good. Doedric, that includes Doedric. Doedric is not actually, like, good with Snowdrop, really. It's incredibly clunky. If you draw them separately, you're fucked. So because of that, like, you would need other payoffs besides the fact that you're mulliganing cards on, like, cards that draw and discard, or that, like, draw and shuffle cards, in order to make Snowdrop good. You would need things like Coral, but Coral's not good enough. In order to make those sorts of cards good, and they don't really exist, so Snowdrop is just bad right now. Iterin's a cool card. Iterin, I'm not going to pretend to fully understand how I would use this card, but the two most interesting uses I found for it were, if you play Caranthier, you can get a second Caranthier target, and this would, I believe, be best with Kiki Queen out of the options. With Koshki, it's kind of funny, but is not actually very good, because you're going to get stuck playing 3 Koshkis and just fill the board from too many Thrive procs, and then not actually be able to get really much value off of the Koshkis. Or Koshés, I suppose, is the better pronoun. Yeah. I'm mispronouncing the bug thing. I apologize. I'm aware. So I don't really know how good that'll be. I think it will be good in a Kiki deck, but obviously the card is still just very vulnerable. Kind of needs to be played behind a Cave Troll, and you start to wonder if that's too many pieces. If it does go off, it's kind of like having a Death Shadow. You'd get another Kiki, and that's really good. And can potentially be a ton of points. The other use that I think is a little more practical is I think it could go into Assimilate. Assimilate just spawns a lot of cards, a lot of random garbage. Some of them might have orders or things that add value to the 1 power token. I'm not sure if Iterin is good enough, but it has a chance, honestly. It kind of depends on how much you're willing to run a 6 for 8 engine. I think it's a pretty good engine if it lives. But if it regularly dies in the meta that we go into, then, I mean, it's not dying efficiently, so probably it'll just get cut. Definitely an okay card, but not like super obvious what like super good deck it goes into. Probably the best deck that would consider playing Iterin is Assimilate. I think the buffs to Assimilate are pretty significant, as well as more options in that deck. Cosimo is a card that I kind of just wish didn't exist. Thankfully, for now, I'm getting my wish. Yeah. Geralt Quinn. Yeah. Geralt Quinn Geralt Quinn is interesting. When I first saw this card, I assumed that, oh yeah, this card's gonna be really cool with Bear Witcher. But now that I see like the actual Skellige location, as well as like the rest of the Skellige cards in general, I'm just not that impressed by that. Because a lot of the value in playing Bear Witchers is just healing them anyway. And I'm also just not super confident in Skellige as a faction going into this expansion. Where I do see Quinn shining is in NR. I think Quinn will actually be great in NR, and I think NR will be significantly better. Which I know is not the popular opinion, but there, I said it. But yeah, this card, if you're giving an important Witcher a shield, is really good, but you do have to note it's pretty expensive to explicitly rig this with a specific target in mind. This card kind of has to hedge the line between being a tutor card and being a setup play card, which removes some value from it. Like, either you're playing this sort of as like a 2 for 10 tutor with a shield, or you're giving a specific card that you probably drew and mulliganed a shield with Adrenaline 3, which is kind of restricting. But could be strong with the White Witcher still. It's a very flexible card. It's very cool. I think it'll be fun to see how people get the most mileage out of it. Is this good enough tutoring Arnagod? This forces you, if you tutor Arnagod with this, you're playing Arnagod late, and I also think Arnagod is just kind of not very good. I will get to that later. But in theory, if you're building a deck around Arnagod, this is one possible way to do it, and it's probably fairly strong. Elzer's the only card that we have already. Elzer, I've made an appearance in World Masters, and I would argue a legitimate one. I certainly wasn't personally considering Elzer in the Kelly deck, but when I saw it, it made sense. There's like barely enough spells that the card is a legitimate threat, and the more cards that force a heat wave in the Kelly deck, the better. Is really what it boils down to. I don't expect that deck to stick around for next meta at all. I think this next meta is going to be much more tall punishing for several reasons that I will get into. So I think Elzer will sort of get worse. But I think Elzer, like, you can't rate Elzer as an unplayable card because it is played, and in the right deck, it is a powerful card. A lot of people just jam it into the wrong decks, probably because it was released on its own and people wanted to find ways to play it. But the card is okay. The trick is just having a deck that both has other threats and spells. There are not many of those. In decks like Moby, this will like get very uniquely heat waved for a lot of value. Although you could argue that like Assault can still get heat waved and it's sort of okay, depending on the matchup. So it's a tricky card to use. Probably people don't want me to talk about it too much since we've seen it. But yeah, those are my rough thoughts. Moving on to monsters, we have Hybrid. Half beast, half mutant, half joke. I really wish this card worked with Hunger. Next we have Spontaneous Evolution. Boost an allied unit by 4 and gain an additional effect based on its unit's category. So the Insectoid effect and the Beast effect are both potentially very good. The thing is, I don't actually see the Beast effect really going into many decks. And I don't really see the Insectoid effect going into many decks. Like, the effects are good in the right decks, but I don't think this card is good enough to push those decks. Like, AQ in particular loves this card, right? Because it's an organic, and it plays as more A-rushes or more drones if you're going Swarm AQ. But the biggest problem AQ had was your bronzes were all fine. Your bronzes, there are like enough good bronze organics to like build a solid core. It's that you were either playing the bronze organics or you were playing these random ass golds that just like don't do that much. Like that aren't much better than the bronzes. Like it's really hard to get a ceiling as AQ. It feels like if you ever play a 10 card round, you just lose to your opponent having some sort of better cards. And because of that, you have to push and make sure that you're playing the maximum 16 cards to try to force your opponent to play as many bronzes as possible and try to capitalize there. But like as bronzes have gotten better, other decks' bronzes have caught up, and AQ's just kind of fallen by the wayside. So I feel like this is a good card for AQ, but it feels like the wrong card for AQ to ever really come back. The deck that I think it has a little more of a chance in is Swarm. Which could be AQ, could be something else. Probably if we're talking Drone Swarm, it's AQ. The problem I have there is, if the Beast effect spawned rats, I would say this card is good. But I think rats are better than drones. I think there are more reliable ways to play Rat Swarm than Drone Swarm, and you can probably do it with better leaders as well. So the card is really cool. This is actually one of my favorite cards in the set, design-wise. I'm very glad they're printing it. I suspect at some point this will have a home, but right now it's kind of just not the card that the deck it's trying to support needs. Fuka. Fuka is a card that has gotten a lot of shit for being, I guess for multiple reasons. And yeah, the card isn't good. But it's not that bad. I don't know. There's not much more to say about it. I'm not gonna actually defend it as like, oh yeah, I'd put it in this deck. But it probably won't lose you that many games to play Fuka, for what it's worth. Okay, I'm just gonna move on now. Succubus. This was another one that was really hard to evaluate. Succubus, I think, is really interesting because if you actually play 2 Succubi, it is a lot of value. Like you can eat the Succubi up to 4 times. If you eat them both at once, they will both spawn each other. And you also have the location to potentially spawn a third one if you need one, or if you happen to have so many consumes that you can use 3 of them. So if you're playing 2 Succubi and you're reliably eating them, which with Hunger is possible to do, if you're running a deck like built around them with stuff like Keraserin, you are getting 2 20 for 5s minus 4 consumes, which is really, really good value for a bronze. But you have to engineer your entire deck around Succubus. It's kind of not like Ruahine in the sense that Ruahine is a gold, and if your opponent bleeds you, you can potentially at least find a time that's most convenient for you to play Ruahine. If you're playing Succubus and you get bled, and it's like not really clear what your round 1 plan is if you're running a deck full of consumes, then you have to wait for like the Adrenaline 4 and then also play a 4 for 5 on the board before playing another one and they actually start doing anything. Like it seems like an extremely bleedable combo. It seems a little too hard to build a deck around. The biggest problem with this card, if I'm being honest, is that V exists. As well as Koshki or Koshe. Like it kind of just gets outclassed. I like the design of this card. I feel like if these two weren't a thing, I would unironically consider it. It's better than it looks. Or maybe worse than it looks. I guess actually some people on TA thought this card looked really good. Initially. So one or the other, Pepe Smile. But I think in the end it won't be played. Interesting card though. Chimera. Chimera is another card where, kind of like Spontaneous Evolution and Succubus, I really want to like it. Like the ceiling really is there in the right deck. But it's kind of another matter of, is the right deck good? In the case of Chimera, you could argue that it actually is. And exactly rats, I think Plague Maiden is much closer to being viable than most of the other swarm options. And Chimera is really efficient compared to something like Bone Talisman, which is a card that's seeing play in that deck. So this card is quite strong. Again, monsters getting some other options. I think this card will be a little bit overshadowed, which I find kind of unfortunate because I think a lot of the other monster designs are really cool. But this one I would say has hope. It does at least take a different direction from something like V, which goes really tall. Like this could potentially avoid going tall entirely by just playing that many Bone Talismans. Chimera exists for location. I don't even know what that means. Yeah, anyways, we have Were-Rat. Were-Rat is kind of looking like it's meant to be for Chimera. It as well as for Succubus. Like this card wants a lot of consumes, and then it can also spawn rats. It's kind of this weird hybrid card. It's not really possible to get full value out of both the consuming and the ability to spawn rats. But I think it's okay as a support card in both decks. It's kind of just a matter of, are the decks good? Were-Rat's less exciting to me than something like Chimera, because Chimera at least sort of pushes those decks. Chimera is only the row. It's not actually all copies of the token. If it was all copies of the token, this card would be a lot more interesting. Like, this card still does have a ceiling of, like, 12, I'm pretty sure. 12, I mean, ignoring stuff like Thrive. So it's really not that amazing. But, like, yeah. If you have a Were-Rat in the row, it's also another card that can't be boosted by Chimera in the row. It would be broken then. I'm not necessarily sure it would be broken. It has Adrenaline, its tokens. That deck is not good right now. Like, compared to Bone Talisman, it's still, like, it's a lot better, but it's not, I would not call the card objectively broken if it boosted every copy of the token. It's pretty hard to get more tokens than, like, the ones on one row anyway. Unless you're saving, like, exactly Caranthir Maiden, or, like, a Maiden and a Were-Rat. I disagree that it would be broken then. I actually kind of thought that's what it did, if I'm being honest. I think this card will be, like, quite a bit weaker. Because, like, I was being kind of conservative and saying, yeah, that's kind of what it does most of the time. So yeah, there's Idder. Idder, I don't actually think is very good. Idder is better than Hybrid. Because it at least wants, like, this card is at least big enough that it wants to be played in a round 3, which is kind of useful, given that the big consume rounds just never happen in round 1. There's not really a card in round 1 that, like, wants to play a bunch of consumes, besides Slizzard, but Slizzard's kind of weak, and Slizzard's just really prone to being removed. If you build your deck around Slizzard and Slizzard dies, you're just done. It feels like. So being able to play a card that's actually playing for, like, the round 3 consume plan, rather than having to play a literal 4 provision card in round 3 for it to do anything, feels a lot better. Well, that being said, I'm confused as to what this card is actually supposed to do. Like, sure, it kinda sort of enables Chimera, but it does it way less efficiently than a lot of other options, like the Were-Rat or the Plague Maiden. Or even something like Spontaneous Evolution. I can see how you would go drones with Chimera now, given that this only boosts a row. The ceiling on this card is lower. I was assuming you were trying to get the higher ceiling, so I was thinking rats. But for what it's worth, this card almost in a weird way looks better because Chimera is worse. It kind of opens the Insectoid option from this card up as being a way to try to get the Chimera payoff. but obviously still worse. But yeah, Eder is like okay value. It comes with 1 consume, so it's kind of 8 for 8 plus 1 for consume, plus like a little bit of Chimera utility, but the Chimera utility isn't that much. It's like, eh. You need to play a lot of consumes for this card to actually be high value. I'm just not that impressed. I don't really think there's going to be a consume monster deck with the other options. Doldolok. So this card you only want to play if you want a Succubus or you want a Chimera. In theory, you could play the Fuka in like more mid-range monster decks and just use the card to draw your Yigern or your Spear Tip or whatever big thing you want. And you get 2 points worth of value on a Fuka, which, okay, that's pretty shit. You're paying quite a bit to move a card to the top of your deck. There's got to be better options. So yeah, you want a Chimera or you want a Succubus. Are the only reasons you play this card. In the Chimera deck, it'll be pretty fine. In the Succubus deck, it's really clunky, because if you end up not needing the Succubus, the other options are pretty bad. Another reason why I would say I would rate Chimera slightly better than Succubus. Overall, this is probably the worst location of the lot. I think I can say that pretty confidently. Koshé on reveal looked really, really strong. For sure. There's like a lot of points you can get out of this potentially. There was this meme going around where there was a screenshot of like Koshé being worth 31 value for 10 provisions. And it had a Mata in it, so it wasn't exactly accurate in my opinion. It was sort of undermining it a little bit. And I think you also want to play Caranthir with this card so that you're not totally fucked if you end up getting bled. Though maybe you're just still kind of fucked, depending on how combo-y this deck ends up being and how many pieces you need to run to reliably have the Koshé ready. Or like how many other packages you can run to stop a bleed. I think this card would be good, but this card exists, so it's not that good. This card will be good once this card gets hotfixed. I'm not sure precisely how good. The other problem for this card is that the meta is switching up quite a bit. I think there's going to be quite a bit more hate, things like locks and poisons that can actually deal with this card. And it's pretty bad when it runs into those. But in theory, if the meta is not too control-y, it is definitely possible to win round 1 as monsters. And then you can bleed out other Gradier engine decks and get a short round with Koshé. And that is really good. Like as a plan, I think that is pretty solid in a vacuum. But I just don't think the meta will be kind to it. I will say it is probably this, like, by process of elimination, it's the second best monster card. But I don't actually think we'll see that much of it right away. And then finally we have V. V is the most broken card in the set. Yeah, it's also not in a fun way. It's just like, it's really funny because everyone's like Pogu Siri Dash, and like on reveal I was kind of like Pogu Siri Dash, Pogu Hyper Thin Monsters. That was my deck, like with Woodland Spirit. I fucking loved that deck. And then I like started thinking about it more, and like there are a lot of tutors, and the Death Wish is really deceptive because it's like, sure, you have to consume it if you want to play around things like Heatwave and Invo and whatever. But with Hunger you get 3 for free. It's pretty easy to have consumes on the board. And it's not like, oh, you're getting 3 points per consume, because you're in addition getting another gold card, and every gold card is getting, like every gold card after the one that you consume, like every V after the one that you consume is getting the 3 points from the consume. So your consumes can actually be worth like a pretty crazy amount of value. You can easily tutor this card like Santu made a template deck of it, which didn't even look optimized, and it still looked really crazy just how many points this card could be. Even more toxic about this card, in my opinion, is just how much better it is on red. Like, the game plan of this deck is really simple. You simultaneously slam points and make carryover. The slamming points part of that is not nearly as good on blue. V with Caranthir. Why would you ever play this card with Caranthir? You only need one. Caranthir is terrible in this deck. It's going to actually fuck your tutors sometimes. Yo, B-Fox, thank you for the raid as well. Much appreciated. Hope you had a good stream. So yeah, this card is going to get up to like 30 plus points, and it's going to be kind of gross. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see if there are any decks that can beat it. Though I imagine there probably are. But yeah, this card, I think this card is going to get hotfixed before it warps the meta, or rather, I hope it does. Knowing CDPR, it's pretty hit or miss on whether they hotfix these sorts of things. Is V worse than Ethereal on release? Yes. Ethereal was not that bad. There were decks that could compete with Ethereal. This card will not be able to be competed with except by Nilfgaard. Or like Regis Higher Vampires that don't get answered. Nilfgaard kind of counters this. Not really. Nilfgaard doesn't counter it that much. They get one Avar that trades up with 1V. Eventually they will get to Invo. But not before you consume a bunch. And play like a bunch of big cards. SK with more can champions charge? Not even close. Not even fucking close. But yeah. This card is not okay. The game cannot handle old Siri Dash. Like it feels like if anything, there are more like problems with it now than there were. Like, oh god, lockdown will help. Lockdown will definitely help. Lockdown doesn't guarantee a win, but I think lockdown probably will win. Like you can still just play consumes manually. This card is efficient enough that you can get away with running like bar guests and barbs for this card. But sure, you probably can counter it out. It's just really not going to be fun. What was old Siri Dash? Basically this card, but without a provision cost. It was a gold card and it had one more strength. Viper Witcher Adept. Moving on to Nilfgaard. So this is a 3 for 4. At the end of the turn, boost self if you have more cards. Originally, I actually rated this card quite highly, but they made 2 changes that really kill it. The first one is the portal change. Portal was kind of how you wanted to play these cards. And now you can only play one. And that's really kind of bad. Wasn't this card buffed to 4? No, this card was revealed at 4 and then nerfed to 3. Or maybe errata to 3. I'm not even sure it was ever supposed to be 4. You never know. Flip a coin. So yeah, the portal change really, really hurts this card because there is the possibility of playing a 3. Portal simultaneously pulled both of these at once, so you got the value of having double engines and guaranteed that these were actually on. And even at 3, that card is pretty good by standards of a Nilfgaard Bronze, and I think it would see play with Portal. The other problem, though, the nail in the coffin, is the Nausicaa Sergeant buff. The Nausicaa Sergeant buff, given that there's no reliable portal, I think Nausicaa Sergeant is just a better card than this card, and it will fill the niche, and it'll do it way better. Nausicaa Sergeant just works. You can always play it as a 4/4 that trades with a piece of removal, which is pretty on par, pretty decent in its own right. And it also just is likely to proc more times, especially in ball decks. And given that this card will be oppressive for the first few days, I think ball is the way to go in Nilfgaard. I think there will be a lot of deploys. So this card fell by the wayside. It's not going to be good anymore. Coated Weapons. Coated Weapons is another card that looked really good to me at first because it was like Pagu, a tactic, and Enslave that doesn't suck. And simultaneously, you can potentially get free value on things like Colgrim. I really wanted to build like a Colgrim hyper-thin portal list, but this sort of also got indirectly shafted from that change. Unlike Viper Witcher Adept, this is still a pretty good card. In Enslave, you will play this card, like, period. In a Colgrim deck, you will probably still consider this card, although the Death Blow on Coated Weapons is a lot worse than the Adrenaline on Viper Witcher, because you're playing this to kill a card, and then playing that card again probably isn't that bad. Whereas Viper Witcher, you can give them the trashiest of trash, or you can give them a good card and yoink it, or do something else. So the Death Blow is like deceptively not that value, but if you're playing Colgrim, still pretty value. And Colgrim is still a decent card. So I mean, I think it will mostly be an Ardal card, but yeah, it's a good Ardal card. It's a tactic. Enslave 7. Viper Witcher. So Viper Witcher, I think, is probably the best of the Viper cards. This card is like deceptively pretty high value. On its own, it's a 6/5 if you play around the Adrenaline 6, which is not that bad of an Adrenaline. You give your opponent a card that they have to mulligan, potentially with more option value. And if you're playing Colgrim, you increase the stack on Colgrim by 1. So it's kind of like carryover in that sense. I think it's a pretty efficient card. The problem is just that this whole deck is going to get replaced by Ball because of V. Like, I don't really think you're going to be playing Colgrim, even though I think Colgrim should be good. Nilfgaard, in my opinion, is the faction that got more and more depressing as the expansion got revealed. Like, between the later reveals on Nilfgaard and V, like, Nilfgaard started out so hot. Like, the first reveals were like these 3 cards in Colgrim, and I was actually like, Pog. This seems like a pretty good direction for Nilfgaard to be going in. And then I saw the other reveals, and not as much of a fan, design-wise. Viper Witcher Alchemist. This card is pretty bless RNG. I don't like this card. I don't think it's actually a good card, but it is a lot better than like Ophiri Merchant. I don't really like that they're trying to push Ophiri Merchant. It felt to me like a meme card. It's like not what you want the faction identity to become. People hate when you like can't play cards. Like when they the only thing people hate when they can't, that more than like not being able to play their deck because Nilfgaard fucking kills everything, is like not being able to play their deck because Nilfgaard literally steals their cards. So like design wise, if this card is good, I'm not sure why. Like, this card will anger Reddit, and I can't really claim that it's like for no legitimate reason, like I do in some cases. Because this card will piss me off too when it yoinks like my Oniromancy that I didn't draw with fucking Warrit. I do think this card is worse than Cantarella, for what it's worth. I think this card will probably be secondary to Cantarella. Just because Cantarella like actually plays the card, it works cleaner. It has more synergies potentially. But there's a chance this is good enough in something, and I really don't want it to be. I will say one thing that makes particularly the Alchemist and the Mentor worse than they seem is that your opponent can just tutor the cards that you give them. If your opponent actually draws Oniromancy, you might just be giving them more gold cards, while there's no guarantee that the card that you steal is like actually good for you to play. Although it does guarantee that they don't get it, which oftentimes is a lot of the value. But like that's just what makes it even more high rolly, right? Because the difference, but literally any Nilfgaard deck is fucking thrilled to steal Oniromancy. Like the difference between stealing Oniromancy and your opponent playing Oniromancy and denying this combo will just flat out decide games. Like whether it's the Alchemist or the Cantarella or whatever fucking Mentor, like whatever bullshit they throw at it, it will just decide games. And I don't like by way too much. The Mentor, at least, I think was a more acceptable design, which I guess I will now talk about. The Mentor was more acceptable to me because in round 3 you can really rig this, and your opponent at least won't just be like getting the card again. It's less likely that they're keeping tutors, and you can also combo it with Gorthikvade, sorry, in order to actually get it immediately, which I think is kind of cool. I mean, in theory, you can do that with the other cards, but like moving a card from the graveyard just to steal it isn't that good, right? Because you're not yoinking resources that the opponent's now not getting. You're just taking one of their cards and then having it for next round, which there may not be a next round. So like this combo is not nearly as good as like this combo. And this combo is like kind of interesting, and you can build your deck around this card a little bit more. You can Vigo for it. It's not as blatantly, I don't have a plan, let me steal your cards, as something like this card is. Or this one especially. Gellert is probably the biggest offender here. I don't think this card will actually be good, but the difference in power level between drawing this card round 1 and not drawing this card round 1 is pretty notable. It's just like, eh. It's not great. Like these sorts of cards are hard to evaluate. 7 for 8s are not that good. The pro player in me just wants to say 7 for 8, Pepe point, some menial unreliable text. But obviously you can get really high upside off of the effect if you can actually yoink the card with Cantarella or like play a bunch of mentors. Like there are some decks that play this card for sure. It's just a matter of if they're good. And I think, quote unquote, thankfully, more Nilfgaard decks will just be focusing on Ball and trying to take down V. I've never been so happy to say that Nilfgaard is going to be the Ball faction again. God. Oh my god. These cards, man. Colgrim, on the other hand, I think is pretty pog. I liked the idea for Colgrim a lot. Simply adding trash to the deck is still kind of obnoxious, but it's much less obnoxious, and it doesn't at least feel like, oh, I can't play my cards. Like, if you run tutors, you still can play your cards. It's just a little bit more of a cost. Potentially, you have to risk, like, avoid mulligans to avoid drawing junk. And the Colgrim's really cool because you can push it 2 ways. You can run hyper thin or you can run clog. And I think that is legitimately a pretty elegant design. You can get a lot of value off of this card. It's a card that, when I initially saw it, felt worth building around. Unfortunately, I don't think it will be anymore, with how things are shaping up. But I think it's a cool addition to Nilfgaard. I really want to see more directions like this one that aren't like just haha Nilfgaard. Like Nilfgaard needs more proactive game plans. Nilfgaard as the K controller faction that sometimes just joinks cards doesn't really feel like it'll be a sustainable identity, or one that will ever actually be very well liked. Like, I think the most interesting Nilfgaard decks from times in the past have at least done something more proactively, in addition to having control tools. Like, some of the control tools are a lot more fair than others. Gorthikvade, this card is quite good. Mostly because of the order, but it also just has solid spawns and decent flexibility. I think the order, if you time it well, can be very, very strong. I don't know. There's not a ton else to say. We just talked about all the cards this card can spawn. Yeah. It's a big enabler for this card. I think without this card would be pretty doomed. So I guess that's cool. I don't know. I don't really find it that cool. And then we have Viper. Viper's sort of interesting, but it also is sort of not interesting in the sense that they didn't actually give you anything to like use to build around Viper. And if you get high rolled, quote unquote high rolled, and this card gets answered, you just kind of lose. You don't like lose depending on the round one situation, but you're not in good. It's not good. This card goes into your own graveyard. Is not very good. And even if this card ends up in your opponent's graveyard, this card could potentially come out at a meaningless time. It's sort of like Old Wolfsbane in that sense, though definitely much less pog than Old Wolfsbane in terms of raw value. You can Asir it, yeah, but the problem is if you Asir it, this card is actually worthless the second time around. And you're also playing a worthless 6 for 8, just to avoid giving your opponent a 7. After you played a 7 for 9. Card is bad. And then you have this card. Yeah, this card. Yeah. Oh, Asir's gonna be 7p? Yeah, it doesn't make that situation better. It would make Asiring something like Shoot better, for sure. Like, Asir might be on the table, but it's never on the table because of Viper, in my opinion. Ivar. Yeah. That's what Nilfgaard needed. Pepe Smile, more tall removal. Except this one is more punishing than just, oh, I take your points. This is now I yoink your points. The monster player inside me kind of just wants to like roll over and die. This card is pretty good against V. V is so strong that I'm not totally convinced that this card just hard counters V. This will trade well with one of the Vs. With enough other Nilfgaard cards, surely it is strong against V. Like, especially if you play Lockdown. But it's just like, this card is so swingy. There's no Nilfgaard deck that's not going to play this card. And because this card exists, it's going to warp the meta. It's not that the card itself is that good. It's really not, like, that good. But when it is good, it's kind of just, like, stupid good. And I don't like that. Yeah, it is a lot like Rupture, for sure. It's a lot like Rupture. It's better and worse. Rupture, there was just no reason not to play. This card against other control decks is actually, like, almost bad. Almost. But that's never a price that you're going to pay, like, that you're going to not pay for just, like, winning the game against some decks. Yeah, this card, eh. Okay, let's just move on and pretend this faction doesn't exist and talk about Northern Realms. Northern Realms is kind of an interesting one because Northern Realms got quite a bit of trash. But I think a lot of the trash sort of distracted people from some of the cards that could actually legitimately be good. And that I do kind of like the designs of. Target Practice is one of the cards that I think could make it. Target Practice, very simple, conditional 6 for 4. Why the fuck would you ever play this? Except it's a Warfare and it spawns a Witcher student. And Witcher students are a lot more pog than they look. Because you can ratio any number of cards that play Witcher students with a single Griffin Witcher Adept. And Griffin Witcher Adept has a permanent shield, which for some decks will just mean that they can't interact with it. Or they'll have to like heat wave a 4P or something stupid. And like worst case, if decks have like 1 or 2 answers in the form of like lock or maybe some order on the board plus damage, you have a lot of options. You can AA these. You can make more with the fucking, I hate to have the tooltips like don't spawn when my mouse is in the thing. With the location card. You can make another one with that. You have quite a few options, and you only have to have one of these at a time. And 4 is obviously bad, but it's not that bad for being able to turn all of these sorts of cards into 8/4s that also get shields. And I am not memeing when I say that they get shields. I think that this card will make King Ragnar a real card. Not in this meta so much. Because Kek W Avar, Kek W V. To be fair, not so much Kek W Ivar, more Kek W Nilfgaard. Ivar will be online too. Will be offline by the time you play Ragnar. But like, probably you can just get bullied in other ways because the NR Nilfgaard matchup has always been kind of rough for NR. And then they can still just like lasso invo you and answer your other shit that you can do to try to protect Ragnar. And V is just gross. But I do think the Ragnar deck is real, and I do think when some hot fixes happen, if they happen, I say when. I should never say when because then I'll just be like disappointed. But if some hot fixes happen, I think that the Griffin Witcher Adept is actually pretty close in line. Pretty close to being next in line. I think it could be a real deck. Griffin Witcher Ranger, on the other hand, does not really strike me as a real card. I see this mostly as an option that you can spawn from the location. You can transfer the boost to some pretty interesting targets. And if you get a big enough boost, that can seem pretty pog. But the problem with this card is that your opponent just playing cards naturally on an opposing row takes a lot of time. So like this card essentially has adrenaline on it to like even be played at all. And by the time you can play the card, wait a turn, and then transfer the boost, most of the cards that would want to receive a boost are like no longer that interested in getting a boost. Like things like Anna, you should have played by then. So I don't really see the utility of this card as being that good. You can still boost on Sace, and like boosting on Sace is always cool, but there are only so many ways you can want to boost on Sace. And I think the only reason you would even consider this card is if you're playing the Shield Wall Witcher deck. So yeah, you really don't need to boost on Sace if you can just Shield Wall it. It's also good with Adept. it's quote-unquote good with Adept. It's not actually good with Adept. Like, this card is significantly worse than this one as an Adept enabler. It doesn't work right away. You have to wait a turn for this. And it's also just lower value, generally. It's also not a Warfare, which is relevant because of Keldar. Griffin Witcher. Griffin Witcher is just a very mediocre card. There are a lot of decks where I could see this card being almost good enough, and pretty much none of them where I could actually see this card really making the cut. Damaging an enemy unit by 1 has pretty high variance in terms of how good that effect is. Like in some decks, damaging things by 1 every turn, target, like when it's targeted, can be pretty good in something like Moby. But in your more typical engine-y NR deck, it's pretty hard to get a lot of value out of this sort of effect. Like you would need like Moby or Full Test or something like that. And it's just like a pretty mediocre engine. The big quote-unquote advantage of this card is that it locks itself. And no, I don't mean that you can veil it. The veil thing is a meme. I'm just going to shut that down right now. This card can die and you can get stuck with a veil in hand that does absolutely nothing. Can die after you veil it if they decide suddenly it's a priority. You also are just saving like 2 garbage-ass cards for the end of a long round. Like having to play a Veil and this card in a round 3 is usually really bad. Crystal Skull. Crystal Skull is cute. I don't think it's worth running Crystal Skull for this. I would rather just have a TA and TA a better engine. But the Adrenaline 3 is still an upside because one of the big weaknesses of these sorts of engines is that they're not end of turn type things. So tempo can be a lot more of an issue. The fact that at some point this card just automatically plays for potentially 3 points is actually like quite an upside. Like this shutting itself off is net good. And once it shuts itself off, you can make a shield out of it. But I don't really think making just a shield out of this card is good enough, because by the time this Adrenaline goes off, your Keldar should be online. So I think this card just kind of won't make it in anything. I think the actual control-y engine decks would prefer Archer. And I think the Witcher decks just don't want this sort of engine that's like kind of mediocre. And like don't care that much about the damage. Griffin Witcher Mentor. Griffin Witcher Mentor is kind of just bad. It's a little harsh to say kind of just bad. In a really combo-y NR deck, this card could actually be pretty good. It has the potential to play 7 for 5, and it cycles a bit, and maybe the boosting in hand is somehow useful. The Adrenaline kind of limits it. Having to play a card like this as like one of the last 5 is really, really awkward, given that this is like a support card, and it's sort of trying to be a carryover card, but you can't like actually really play this as a carryover card in round 1. This card is just kind of not good enough in anything. I'm not sure what it's trying to do. Yeah. The fact that it's a random, the unit is not controllable is another problem for this card. Cohen. Cohen's a funny meme. Problem is that even when this card works, it doesn't really work with the amount of investment you put into it. In order for this card to actually be like Poggers, the setup you need is Visigoda, Viraxis, and probably like a bunch of commandos. Would probably be the simplest setup. And that would be pretty funny. I look forward to the Dandelion clip. This is I rated this the 3rd worst card in the set, I think. But yeah, it's pretty near the bottom. This card's like This card is for Reddit players to counter Nilfgaard. Bellahoon is required for Cohen. Bellahoon is another option. I don't know if I would go as far as saying Bellahoon is required for Cohen. But I could see Bellahoon for Cohen being worth it. I think Visigoda is better than Bellahoon for enabling Cohen, because the big thing is Cohen doesn't even boost himself. Like, I don't think y'all fully realize like the impracticality of pulling this shit off. Like, if you want to Viraxis this card, which is how you actually get big points, you need to be able to boost Cohen again. And Bellahoon can't fucking do that, but Visigoda can. Like, Visigoda Cohen's the way to go if you want a meme. I want to try to build that deck. This card is pretty funny. Like, this is a card I'm not insulted by existing. It knows what it's trying to do. Keldar. I think Keldar is secretly one of the better cards in the set. It looks innocent enough. The first time I saw this card, I was like, why do I want to pay one provision more for a Von Hurst that only works for like half the round? But in NR, it actually makes sense. In NR, you have other engines, so the Adrenaline 4 is much less of a price tag. There are other cards that you can set up before this card and get value out of. The resupply is actually quite relevant, but by far the biggest thing is that Shield Wall is a leader. There's a kind of a big difference between your Von Hurst dying to an oil or just a thunder of any type, and your Von Hurst like actually living, unless they really, really commit to like heat waving it or something. And I think that's a big deal. You also have access to Donkey Mirror, so you have another way of protecting this card if you want. Donkey Mirror is much more defendery of a defender than Azar. And Azar plus Hurst is also kind of just bad because the row goes too wide. And you want to play your other cards just to complete that comparison. Yeah, you can AA this card, but you don't want to, right? You want to AA after this card because you get another token. Like, this card is actually nuts value. This card, it's pretty easy to get an extra token in addition to your Hearst. It's definitely not impossible to get 2 of them. And every single token from this card is not just worth 2 points. It's worth somewhere between 2... It's worth either 2, 4, or 7 points. And if you can squeak out those extra points, this card can actually be pretty insane amounts of value. Like, I counted it earlier. Like, what happens if you play Keldar, a Griffin Witcher Adept, and a King Ragnar? Just ignoring the other cards in your round, like how many points does that play for? And it was pretty stupidly efficient. Like, the Griffin Witcher Adept is 4 for 4. The Keldar, if you assume 1 Warfare, which I think is pretty average, will play for this will spawn it'll play for 16 baseline. The Griffin Witcher will then be able to transform 4 times because this is an end of turn effect, so you won't be able to transform on one of those turns. So that is 4 plus 16 is 20, plus 2 times 4, so that's 28. And then you will have 5 copies of Griffin Witcher Adept, the initial one plus the 4 you transformed. And then you will play King Ragnar, and King Ragnar is worth 7, 10. King Ragnar is worth... I'm fucking tired. King Ragnar is then worth an additional 19 points. So I believe that's... I said... Fuck, I'm tired. Okay, 12 plus 6, 28, 19. Yeah, that's 47 points over those cards. So obviously the math gets hazy because it's not really fair to say 47 for 21. That's not a fair way of looking at it. Because you're playing 3 cards, provisions are not additive. But if you start breaking it down and sort of just like trying to like if you just fiddle with it a little bit and sort of look like, say, like what would be a good value to be getting out of a card of that provisions, like with those provisions, like say like you want a 13 for 9, an 8 for 4, and like I don't know, a 12 for 8. Like those would be insane value cards, right? But like 13 plus 12 plus 8 is like 33. And that kind of just like paints a picture. Like those are like really valuable, and they're pretty hard to like pretty hard to fuck with if you're running shield wall, because everything's shielded. And NR actually has ways of like protecting their cards, like Royal Guard, Marine, potentially. Although I think this deck will be non-devotion. I think Shield Wall will switch over to non-devotion as a result of these cards, or maybe there will be one of each. Potentially Devotion could stick around. And then obviously Ragnar can grow more if you have other shields, or play Griffin Witcher play the Adept earlier and play like some other cards. So yeah, the ceiling is there. And if you have Last Say, the Ragnar is like the only targetable part of that combo, but if you have Last Say, then it's not that targetable. Like you can replace you can transform Griffin Witcher Adept with Griffin Witcher Adept, so it's not as simple as just remove the shields. And there are also not that many decks that can remove shields super efficiently. You're looking at maybe like Skellige and Scumatel with Precision Strike. Or I guess you could argue Gazarus, but just don't play on the melee row like a Pepega. So yeah, the combo's good. I have not heard many people talk about these cards, but I think that exactly these 4 cards will make it from NR. And Erland's okay as well. Though it goes in a different deck. So yeah, NR did not get nothing. NR has a chance. I've heard a lot of people just write off NR as the worst expansion or the worst faction this expansion. If NR gets bullied, it's because of the meta. Like I could easily see this deck being just pushed out by V. Like if the round 1 of this deck is disgusting enough, even NR might lose round 1 to that deck, and then you're gonna start having problems. And it could also just have problems against Nilfgaard too, just because NR Nilfgaard. Although who knows? Like this matchup would probably look a little bit different. I'm not going to try to break that down too much. But I think the raw potential of this deck is there. And I just wanted to kind of like emphasize that point a little bit, because I feel like the rest of the stuff you could just hear from anyone. But I think that's like one of the key points that I think is being undercommunicated by other people. And then we have Keraserin. This card will see play in this deck. The boost in deck is actually quite useful. Potentially you can use it on an engine. And engine's pretty cool. Potentially you can use it on Unsace and save yourself a shield wall. You're not going to do anything too flashy with the unit in deck, but you can pretty reliably get the unit in deck thanks to AA. You can even order it the same turn. So I think it's pretty safe to say this card is like the bronze unit plus 3 points for 8. Given that the best bronze unit is this one, in theory the math on that isn't great, but absolutely you want to run a 3rd copy of this card if you're playing this card in case you need it. And having the option to play this one, or even these 2, is not so bad. Like, these aren't the worst cards. They're just never cards that I think you would actually main deck. But they're okay to have as options. So Keraserin, I think, is a pretty strong location. Another card that I've heard people call trash that I don't think is trash. If you want trash, you can look at Archgriffin. This could have been a real card. Yeah, this is the 70th card of the expansion. The honorable mention, Pepe Smile. Yeah. It's a little hard to explain just how bad this card is. It's kind of sad because the memes are funny. I want this card to, like, not be that bad. But it is just, in my opinion, it's worse than Cohen. Because Cohen, you could at least in theory set up. And your opponent doesn't just have a super duper easy way to stop you. This card, if it gets tall removed once in any round, is bad. Like, you can boost this card 1,000,000 times in round 1 behind a defender. Your opponent can have no answer to the defender. You can have 30 fucking points with Archgriffin. And, like, you played a bunch of inefficient boost cards to do that. And then in round 2, it can just die anyway. It's really quite sad. Am I forgetting Erland? No, I just really like harping on Archgriffin. I mean, I don't. Honestly, poor Archgriffin. I like the art. Although I do also miss the other Archgriffin. I feel like naming cards the things that they were in beta and then giving them different art is not a good strategy for, like, appeasing the Reddit mob just in general. But I do feel like they did Archgriffin justice. I like this Archgriffin art. Although Archgriffin being in NR is maybe a little weird. It's like, haha, it's a griffin. But I can deal. Erland. Erland is pretty decent. Erland, I think, is probably at its best in something like Full Test. If you get a Merciless opener, it's 2 more units that you can easily pull. We haven't seen any more, like, Dunbanner or Commando type units from this expansion, so you kind of have to work with what's already there if you want to use this card as a carryover card. I don't think this is a card you can rely on just, like, protecting and then Keck W 19 for 12ing, but it is really funny. If you can actually use the order in round 1, this card could just win on even. And you can use the order in the same turn that you play a defender, depending on what deck you're playing. And that's a pretty good meme. Overrated. The card's not... I don't know how people are rating it, but this card is pretty good. Like, when I first saw this card, I was like, it's kind of idealistic. You have to draw it in round 1, or it gets quite a bit more awkward. It's not the worst, because if you draw it late, you can use it for the immunity. And then you get the order, but there's not going to be that many units left in your deck at that point. But honestly, the math on this card checks out. This card is much better in the tournament situation where you know you can get a red coin. And in the full test deck, this plays pretty well into that dynamic. Like, full test doesn't actually care about round 1 nearly as much as other NR decks, and is a deck that actually could abuse carryover. You can get, like, you can mulligan into 5 units, which is overly ambitious, like, per round. But if you say you mull into, like, 3 of them, and then you tutor, like, you get 2 AAs, and then you play a Merciless, like, that's already enough value. I'm pretty sure that comes out to, like, 14 or 15 for 12. Like, with Oniromancy, you're pretty likely to hit this card round 1, and having the backup plan with the card so that it's not absolute trash when you don't draw it is kind of a big deal. I don't think this is a bad card. I could see it replacing Falibor in that deck. I think Falibor is the only card you can actually Dare to Cut from Full Test. That deck has so many combo pieces. So it will be expensive to play this card. It's not like guaranteed in that deck. But it's an option. This is definitely not a card that you can just splash into any NR deck, though. It would honestly kind of prefer to be in an engine deck rather than a full test deck, but it just plays the wrong way for engines. Like, engine decks usually really want... No, full test is Inspired Zeal. That might be your confusion. In Moby, this card is hot garbage. I apologize. Yeah. Oops. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that. So I need to stop using those names. But yeah. Because of that, yeah. Erland has a chance in full test, and it might have a chance in like a really engine-y deck. Getting Carrick Frigate out of like 5 damage range is really big, but like it's hard to know what engine-y deck it would be, because it can't be Devotion if you actually want to play this card like semi-reliably. I guess in theory it could be Devotion if you're like really not gonna thin much and have quite a few units left at the end of the game and are willing to just use this card as points. But that just seems wrong to me, because you always play AAs. Usually at the end of the game you have like 6 or 7. Like this card's not good enough round 3 to justify not being able to play it round 1 80% of the time by having Oniromancy. So it really is the full test deck where you could play this card, I think. And will full test be good next expansion? It'll probably be a little crept out, especially for ladder's sake. Like, this is a card where you'd rather rig the coin for sure. So I guess that's my breakdown of this card. You feel like it's kind of clunky in full test? Nah, it's fine in full test. It's a card that's it's gonna be relatively clunky. Like, it's never gonna be what you want it to be per se, but the math checks out on it that there's a good amount of room for error for this card to still be pretty good in full test. It's more the opportunity cost rather than like the clunkiness. This card is never that clunky to where it's like bad. But yeah, moving on. That's my opinion of the card. Making a bomb. We have Scoia'tael now. Moving on. We have Catwitcher Adept. Moving on. We have Catwitcher Mentor. The first actual card from this expansion. From this faction. We have so this card is a Clear Skies. A lot of people don't really point that out. There are a lot of upsides to this card. On top of it being a Clear Skies in unit form. But Clear Skies is not that great. I'm very conflicted on this card because everyone is like Pogu, Gaetan, Pogu, Gezras. Okay, Cameron's just trying to fuck with me. I'm not going to debate whether making... Okay, but like you're actually... I'm gonna get baited. Why can't we just all agree? Like, okay, the movement effect plus the quote-unquote 4 points is actually not that horrible. But the condition is so bad. Like, Pogu, you can maybe play a 4P Rock Barrage. You think this card is the third best 5p card? That's a statement I can't break down because I have no clue what you're saying. If you mean of the ST ones, it's really not. This one quite sucks. But if you mean like, I don't know what that even means. Do you just mean like in general that it's like better than everything except like Larva and like one other card? Because then you're fucking mad. This card's not that good. Like, after Larva and say, okay, you're fucking mad. So okay, I'm gonna stop listening to you now. Like, sure, the Gay 10 synergy is really good. What else do you do with this card? This card is bad standalone value. And it goes tall in a deck that wants to swarm. You like need 2 of them and then a Gaten for this card to actually be like good. It's okay with Catwitcher, but Catwitcher is kind of overrated in its own right because against this deck you want to row stack. There's like no actual punish for row stacking. You have this card which doesn't work, and you have this card which doesn't work. So I don't love this card. I hear a lot of people be like, Pagu, Catwitcher Mentor, movement. But first of all, to me it reads as Swarm. Because this card is literally Clear Skies. This card has fuck all to do with movement, and I find that kind of lazy. And then second, like, these cards are essentially Clear Skies as well. And second of all, it just totally doesn't fit what the deck is doing. Like, it's going in a completely different direction from all of the other movement cards in terms of, like, point distribution. So, this card, the synergy with Gaten, and potentially just getting some other random movements with, like, converting the Stiga Castle into points, which usually the movement's not really necessarily worth points on its own. But, like, if you're able to get, like, Sentry, potentially you can get, like, a lot of points, but it's like, how many fucking pieces do you want to set up, and how good is it actually? It's like, eh. Like, this card is okay. I think it will be playable. But I think it's being massively overhyped. And I think ST on the whole is also being massively overhyped. I will go ahead and say that I think ST is worse than NR. I think ST is probably the second worst faction going into this expansion. Catwitcher Saboteur. On that note, here's an example of why. This card sucks. You need a full-ish row for this card to do anything. If this card could actually do something, your opponent will play the target on the left. Is there any way to punish your opponent playing the target on the left? Oh, Bran! Huh, rightmost unit. Huh, not Bran. Huh. The first is not SY. The first is Skellige. I'm trying to save my hot takes, Aelith. Please shut up. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, ignoring that conversation that I am not willing to have right now, Catwitcher. Catwitcher is okay. Catwitcher at least like works ends of turn, so you can trade pretty well with removal. With that being said, like, there's still the problem of your opponent by default row stacking, because why wouldn't you against this deck? So it's kind of like half a point per turn until the adrenaline kicks in. But the adrenaline kicks in early enough that this card is actually pretty decent, and sometimes you will have to play cards on the other row, just due to like row locks and things like that. This card is pretty good. This is like probably the best movement bronze. This is the one that I'm actually like maybe a little interested in playing movement for. And it's also like more movie than the other movement bronzes. Like this works with something like a Sentry package that I feel like the actual like good payoff movement cards aren't really necessarily encouraging as much, because it's like they want to be played in a big round, and like the cards that would work with them movement wise are bronzes, and it's kind of weird. Then you have Gaten. Doesn't this movement run Crushing Trap? No. This movement needs tokens more than anything. I don't actually think you can afford to play Guerrilla Tactics. I think you're going to be playing Precision Strike. Because 3 Sentinels is pretty good when you have a Gaten and a Gazarus. It takes fucking forever to play units at one at a time. And there's not actually many ways at all to move enemy units unless you like specifically run them. And like for some reason, all of the cards that like work with moving enemy units just have no synergy with the ones that work with moving allied units. Like it kind of just feels like it's air quotes flexibility, but in reality, you're always going to play them one way. So Gaten, I feel like exemplifies why I don't really like the movement archetype from a design standpoint, as much as some of the others. Gaten is a card you would just play in any deck where you have the row. And like it enables cards by moving them, but it's really only this one, and it's a bronze, and it's weird. Like this is a card that you're going to play first and foremost as a point card. And maybe if you can like double dip on a Sentry somehow, then like cool. But like you don't have to play movement for this card to just be good. And I feel like you kind of won't play movement for this card to be the most good. I feel like you'll play Precision Strike. And yeah. I mean, that's kind of my... Like, the card's good. The card is as good as the faction. This card will be played in almost every ST deck, with the possible exception of a heavily control-based Precision Strike running the Tiger. Like, that seems like the only deck that wouldn't run this card. This is Chimera. It kind of is, and it kind of isn't. Like, Chimera has the cost of you have to play the token generators, and it's more situational. Winfriend's made a list of the 5 Ps that are better than Catwitcher Mentor. That's hilarious. Seems to be ignoring the ones in the new expansion, too. But it is pretty funny. Moving on, we have Bran. Bran, to me, is just a weird card. This card gets better if you play Guerrilla Tactics, but you still miss the 2 points on Guerrilla Tactics. And quite often you're actually missing the 4 points on Guerrilla Tactics when your opponent inevitably row stacks the big unit, and you have to move it twice to get it to the right. This card just requires too many hoops compared to like an actual tall removal, it feels like to me. The card is in theory sort of in efficient enough territory at 4 for 8 where you could only have to kill like a sort of mid-sized unit for it to be decent. And the adrenaline helps a little bit with there like potentially not being enough units to enable the condition. But to me the problem is not enabling the condition. I think with movement you can do that. Like in terms of getting enough units on the row. It's more that even when the condition is enabled, you have to destroy the rightmost one. Like that's where this card is just too specific. Like it's not just about moving cards to a row. It's about like moving cards to a row and then hoping you're like just praying to Shrek that your opponent plays one on the right side. Malena, sure, Malena's a free way to do it. But like, you only get one Malena, and Malena's not cheap, and everyone wants to run every card. And like it still doesn't really work. It's still clunky. Like if you even with a Moleno on the board, you can still rig it so that without wasting a charge on guerrilla tactics, the unit that you want to lives for a turn. And sometimes a turn is all that unit needs. For a lot of cards that have just like really powerful order effects or things like that. Frigate Hearst makes this. Yeah, Frigate or Hearst would be pretty sad with this card. Although in that situation, it's actually not so bad because the non-Frigate Hearst cards have to go on the other row. Like that's actually maybe kind of an ideal situation for this deck because then Gazarus can actually start dipping more. But yeah, moving on. Stiga Castle. This card just will heavily depend on how all in you go on movement. This card is like an actual movement card. If you're playing like full-on Catwitcher Mentors, Doblathana Sentries, anything and everything to try to greed dip on like your 2 big payoff cards, having one more effect that moves will be pretty good. So like in the question for this card is how good is that deck versus the deck that just plays units and plays the good cards. And it's close enough that I think this is a decent card. Like, I think this will be an option. But yeah. Oh, apparently the person who was accusing Catwitcher Mentor of being the 3rd best 5p card thought Hamadryad was a 6. That's pretty funny. I felt the need to work that in. How does it feel, Pepe smile? Oh, man. Anyways. Yeah. Stiga Castle baseline in a non-movement deck is easily the worst location, even worse than the monster one. But if you can build around it enough, it gains quite a lot. If you single dip the effect, it's an okay card for flexibility reasons, but not great. If you double dip the effect, it actually starts getting like quite good. But double dipping's kind of tricky. You can time it though. Like the resilience on this order in particular helps. Like you can choose when it will be the most useful. I think this card's pretty strong in movement, and maybe this will actually be enough to push it more into like an actual movement deck direction. Although I'm still not sure how I feel about that, because movement has just always kind of felt like a flawed archetype to me. And these cards like do not convince me that they solve the problems like from a design standpoint. Like sure, they'll make the deck played, but that's not what I mean when I say solve the problems. Up next we have Sabretooth Tiger. The only card from ST that I actually like design-wise. And you might say, why do you like this card? It goes into the fucking like Precision Strike deck, and that deck is kind of AIDS. But like it's at least cool. So it's got that going for it. I don't know. I like the flavor of it. It like pounces. And like you can try like it's kind of interesting and from the perspective of how much do you try to get extra value out of this card by like killing the units as they're played, and how much do you play around this card. And yeah, unitless. Like realistically, this card will just get played because it's better than say Synthesis. Like this card is a quote unquote immune card. And the upside is better than 1 extra point. So I don't like love this card, and like the deck it goes in could use some revisioning. So I have mixed feelings about this card, but I think it's pretty aight, and it will have a home in that deck. Will that deck be good? Like, eh. Hilariously enough, despite the Precision Strike deck being a control deck, it will get absolutely crushed by V. Like, that deck just cannot run enough tall removals. and they'll be trading down while playing them most of the time. So that's kind of interesting. But then from there we have Gazarus. Gazarus is the card that people are most excited for. Honestly, I kind of think Gaten is better. Gazarus can really, really greed hard if it doesn't get answered and you have 8 units on a row. Like, this is a pretty good Timmy card. I'm not saying this card is bad. The card is good. It's not really fair to just write this off as a Timmy card. And like, you can potentially move this card every turn so that you only get the melee effect and then just consistently boost your units by 8. But like, in the decks that are doing that, it's like hard to get the 8 units because that's where you're probably running guerrilla tactics, right? Like, this card can really smurf, but if you full build around it and it gets answered, you're starting to get into trouble. And it also just doesn't even smurf like that much. Like, if you're having to use the ranged ability, your opponent's melee row is going to be relatively empty because, again, what's the cost? Like, unless the round goes super long to the point where they're forced to play quite a few units there. Yeah, you can Quinn this. Quinning this makes it a lot harder to kill through damage. There are still other means of controlling it, but it will be trading up quite a lot with those. Like, this card is really good in the deck it goes in, especially in the situation where you are in a long round. Like, I'm not going to pretend this card's not good. I'm just kind of writing off the deck. I don't really think the deck is as good as people are saying it's going to be. And I also just don't really love I also just don't really love it from a design point. So maybe it's wishful thinking on my end. Maybe I'm just hoping this deck won't be good. But personally, I'm not really seeing it. Like, the math here is not as insane as something like the Keldar combo. And the Keldar combo is much more self-reliant. Like, this doesn't require like anything on the board. You need 5 turns and the 3 cards. This is like, you get the units. This card, like, okay, technically Keldar can get answered too, but like, it's a little harder to answer given that it's in NR and you have Shield Wall. Like, this you would have to Quinn if you wanted to protect it from removal, or have to play like guerrilla tactics on in like a weird way that doesn't make sense and doesn't let you double dip on the Gazras. But like, yeah, Gazras is good. Gazras is like pretty good. I still rated it as like easily a top 10 card alongside Gaten. Like, these are just very easily the best 2 ST cards. But yeah, Gaten and Gazra's the faction or something. Moving on to Skellige. The faction that I said I thought was the worst, but actually I was just trying to get Aelith off my ass. But also, actually, it's the worst because everyone knows I'm not that good of a liar and I can't fucking contain myself. Yeah. Berengar Adept is not the worst. Berengar Adept is quite good. This card, if you compare it to something like Magni Division, starts to look like not as good as it like could look to someone, because it's sort of like a Magni Division that caps out at 7. You have the option to like Tourney Jousted or remove it. But Magni Division's a good card. That card does not get enough credit, and this card has no condition, like relative to the relative to the Magni Division, which does kind of force awkward row placement. And getting the armor is still some value. And as much as I kind of want to write off the damage synergy, the fact that this card starts out damaged could be relevant. Like, this card is just pretty okay vanilla. It's a pretty good card. I think it'll see play in the Skellige decks. Armor Up, on the other hand, I think is not a very good card. This is a 5 for 5. It does give your Berewitcher Mentor cards +3, which is the only reason you would ever play this. Potentially +4 if the damage is actually turning a unit red. My problem with this card is that this card starts out at 4 for 5, and I don't actually think it's that good. And I definitely don't think it's that good to the point where you want to play Armor Up. There are better ways of enabling the card. But this card is really just not that good. I actually think this card is worse than this one, funnily enough. Like, depending on the meta, damaging enemies is harder than it sounds. If there's, like, green strength, you don't get that many targets. And it's also pretty rare that your Skellige decks are damaging both allies and enemies, and I get that the bronzes are trying to push that with, like, Berewitcher and things like that, but you want to hold on to Berewitcher, like, pretty long because of the adrenaline. And there are, like, only so many cards you can hold in your hand, and these are bronzes. Usually the bronzes are what are getting dumped when you're playing Skellige, and you have a whole bunch of golds that you can't play early. So it's, like, not totally clear to me what you are playing in round 1 as Skellige. You can play this card. This card's okay. You can play some warriors and some boats. Doesn't really fit the Berewitcher Mentor deck at all. Like, it's just not clear to me how you're supposed to build this deck. Berewitcher Mentor's power creep boar, it must be decent at least. Yeah. Poor. Oh my god, fucking boar. This card really does put boar to shame. I'll give it that. Berewitcher Quartermaster. Berewitcher Quartermaster, for how much shit I gave Berewitcher Mentor, you would think I probably also think is kind of bad. But no, you could cash this card in on a Draco Turtle. And that's kind of good. Problem is that you're playing Draco Turtle and you're playing Skellige. Like, I don't actually see this as going in the Berewitcher deck. I see this as going in a deck that, like, actively wants the self-damage for other purposes to get points. Like, this just seems like a clean way to cash out armor. Oftentimes, Draco Turtle misses a bit of armor. You can play this immediately on a Draco Turtle. It can potentially get it out of some removal ranges, like Enslaves and things like that. Like, this card actually has a niche in a deck, and it's not the one that you think it does. But I don't see the deck being played, so I don't really rate the card. Berewitcher, I do rate. Berewitcher's a good card. 8 for 5 is pretty good. Part of it is damage. It can be healed by this card. Yeah, Berewitcher is good. Everyone's going to be like, Pogu, it can be Quinned by Quinn, as like a 13 for 10 that you have to hold. That looked a lot better before they printed this card, because you can't have your cake and eat it too. And this card is nuts, much more so than Quinn on this. And it's not totally clear how many other Witchers you're actually going to want to tutor with Quinn. Everyone's going to be like, Arnagod, Arnagod. I'm going to be like, fuck you, fuck you. Yeah. So I'm not really a big fan of that combo as much, although it might be playable. I think Quinn is still playable with Berewitcher. But I think this is much better. But yeah, Berewitcher good. You don't need anything for Berewitcher to be good. Berewitcher's just a good card. Gerd is also a pretty decent card. Gerd got more shit than he deserved. It's not too hard for your opponent to just play like 3 units on the same row and cash out a 10 for 7, and potentially enable some Bloodthirsts, which I don't really see as enabling this card so much, because damaging things by 1 is like a little unreliable for getting the Bloodthirsts. Although it could be. You never know, it depends on the deck you're facing. But it could also just be useful for like Skellige control cards, just like the usual fare. So I think in any deck that's not like super warrior oriented, I think this is a pretty good mid-range card. But it's just not like a pushing mid-range card, right? Like, there's no deck that you're gonna play so that you can play Gerd. It's not that good of a card. Like, Adrenaline 4 gives you enough time to use this card. Like, your opponent will have to play 5 cards. It's pretty hard for your opponent to not be giving Gerd acceptable value if you get it round 1. Obviously, if you don't get it later, it's a 7 for 7. And you could say that kind of sucks, but it like plays standalone. And it's still a big body. And potentially it's one Bloodthirst or a Blood Eagle enabler or who knows what. Like, it's not the worst case. And it's pretty good round 1. And, like, Skellige does kind of need cards that it can play sometimes. Like, I don't think Gerd is bad. I just don't think Gerd is, like, meaningfully good. Junod, on the other hand, I think is bad. This card, if it was actual Vabjorn, would have some hope. But they downgraded Vabjorn by making it a Witcher. So it can no longer be tutored by Blood Eagle, which is kind of a massive deal for a card this situational. Especially given that you could potentially Blood Eagle into Vabjorn if there was enough Bloodthirst on the field. So kind of a shame. I don't really think Vabjorn would be like played heavily, but it wouldn't be unplayable. This card to me is just kind of unplayable. Like, it's not clear where you try to play this. Hern Kaduk. When I first saw this card, I thought it might be the best card of the set. And then I looked at the Skellige cards. Yeah, this card won't carry Skellige. It's really easy to get 11 for 8. It's not hard to get 14 for 8. This card is insanely efficient. But, like, what else are you playing in Skellige? Like, you have to play the Witcher stuff, too. You can splash the Witcher stuff in Warriors. I think that's probably going to be the best Skellige deck. You literally just run, like, these 2 cards in Warriors. Probably cut the Gerd since you have Warriors. Maybe run Dire Bear. Is there any situation where this card is better than Turgvi? Which card are we talking? I don't think there. Oh, you mean Junod? I don't. Yeah, there. Oh, wait. Like, yeah, there is. Turgvi can get purified. It is kind of funny. It's really hard for this card to be better than Turgvi. I never thought of that. I mean, technically, you can last play this card. It's not strictly worse than Turgvi. In Onslaught, being able to last play this card is pretty good. Pepe smile. Onslaught, by the way. So yeah. Hernkaduk, you play this card, you take the fucking Bear Witcher. And then you heal the fucking Bear Witcher. The next turn if it lives. If it dies, you still heal another Bear Witcher, and that one can't be played around, so you get the 11. And if it lives, potentially you play another Bear Witcher. Pog. Like, play a Hernkaduk, play a Bear Witcher seems to be the faction identity. Yeah. That's my analysis of the Skellige cards there. Dire Bear. Dire Bear got revealed as a 7, and I thought this card totally sucked. But Dire Bear is now an 8. I don't think Dire Bear sucks at 8. This card can now get more marginal value and be okay. Besides, like, the dreams of just, like, stopping an Osril or like stopping a Gazarus in a movement deck that runs absolutely no movement. Like, this card, like, when you do get those dreams, it's a lot of points. But, like, in most cases, you can just boost the units on the other row. Which is, like, a little bit tough. How do you protect Dire Bear? I think you don't. I think this card is very specifically a tech card, and it's probably something you want to time to, like, stop people from boosting. Like, if you know your opponent's going to last play Oswald to play around Mork, and you also have a Dire Bear in your deck, you can kind of fork, and you can play, like, a Dire Bear, and it can be kind of rude. So there's that. Probably the best thing you can do with Dire Bear is disable engines that are already placed on the field in like some other matchups. Like if you play this against a Drunger, a Drunger. Okay, this has been long. A Drummer or something of the sort. Potentially an Anna. Against that deck, it'll probably just get dueled. But it's an idea. It can be played against a Sea Jackal. Potentially, it could bottleneck out Spenders. There are pretty sneaky ways to use this card, and at 8 for 9, the opportunity cost isn't that high if it does nothing. So I actually think this card has a chance, and I think it'll probably be surprisingly useful more often than you'd think. But again, it's just not like the card that carries Skellige to me. Like, if the best strategy for Skellige is Dire Bear and pray your opponent can't make points, I'm not a huge fan. And last we have Ornegod. Ornegod, I think, is, in my opinion, the worst of the Kingpin Witchers. Or so I've been calling them. I don't really know what they're actually supposed to be called. Ornegod can be quinned. Quinning this card is funny. I don't know. Can't quinn this and Bear Witcher. This card can still just get answered. Like, the problem I have with this card is that in a mid-range Skellige deck, it's very uniquely answerable. Sort of like Dire Bear, but Dire Bear is more efficient and cheaper. I don't actually think the gaining of armor will do much to make you want to play the damage stuff. The armor to me seems mostly irrelevant. Like, the two ways to actually try to play this card and actually get some value out of it are to play it with Quinn, which comes online really late because of the Adrenaline 3. Like, it costs you a turn, which kind of hurts with this card. Or you play it with Succubus. The Succubus meme is pretty funny. If you can actually protect Arngod Succubus with Covenant, it's not GG. It's really not GG. This card has other problems, but it is funny. Like, especially if you can boost it more, it is pretty funny. I think this card has more of a chance to be played in an Arnagod deck than it does in a mid-range Skellige deck. Just because I'm not convinced this card is actually very good value. It has the potential to deny cards, but it's not like dueling where you gain value. It's simultaneous. In theory, it should be an even trade. It's like, so like your opponent, you need to be killing something that your opponent wanted to save. And if this card ever takes off, your opponent can just play those cards earlier. Is kind of like the problem I have with this card. And like, your opponent can also just save really small units or like spells, depending on the deck. Or your opponent can save one really large unit and just one punch this card. Like, there are a lot of monster cards, like a certain one that I think is going to see a lot of play that will kind of just Pepe point this card as it dies in one hit. I think that's a pretty funny interaction. Although obviously if you shield it, it gets another hit off and then it plays for like 14 and that's like more fine. But like if you have to totally build around it, it's like and it's certainly not like carrying a deck. I'm not a big fan of this card. I think it's a card that looks a lot cooler than it will actually be good. I guess it's not fair to say I'm not a big fan of the card, because I like the design of this one more than some of the other SK ones. It's really pushing something, it's doing something different with the faction, but it still feels Skellige-y. But like, I don't actually think it's going to be that good. I'd like to be wrong. I'd like for this card to be better. You can do Marjoram with this card, sure. Marjoram can be pretty funny. Like, you can do things with this card, but it's still, in theory, unless you play Succubus to actually really imbalance the duel, which is unreliable for several reasons. Like, unless you're doing that specifically, this card will like still be dealing and taking the same amount of damage, because you can't overkill units for value. And that I see that as a big problem with this card. Yeah. Like, to me, it's like, it feels like you play it for 7 plus a little bit of armor, or you Quinn it for 14 plus a little bit of armor. And like, Quinning it for 14 is a lot better, assuming the shield doesn't get removed somehow by something like Strike or an Order ability. But it's still kind of just, yeah. And for all that work, it could still just get removed, which is something I've kind of been leaving out of that picture. So I'm not very hopeful for this card. Anyways, we have SY now. SY is, in my opinion, by far the most poggers. Not because it'll be like the best, but I think it will genuinely be good. It pushes an entirely new archetype, and the cards are fucking cool. Whoever designed SY deserves a raise. I don't know who it was. So Salamandra Lackey, 4 for 4. At the end of your turn, if you gained at least 1 coin this turn, boost self by 1. The biggest issue with this card is that SY4s are really, really good. It's tricky to know exactly what deck is going to be reliably gaining coins enough to boost this enough to where it's like a really good engine. If this card procs every turn, it's kinda nuts. Probably the best hope for it is that you run a leader that can run a lot of run a lot of token coins and potentially burn them off in round 3 if you're forced to play this in round 3. And then this card will be a surprisingly good engine for a 4P. In cash, even, like, sure, you get an extra turn of this, and I think it'll be pretty decent in cash, depending on the deck. I think it's a card that you can play in any SY deck, and it will be fine, other than, like, Firesworn, maybe. It's just hard to know where it's good enough. It's like Baby Townsfolk. It is kind of like Baby Townsfolk. Like, that's pretty apt. But it doesn't do the degenerate things that Townsfolk do. It is a lot better than Townsfolk, though. Like, this card is good. It's just difficult for me to know if it'll be played, like if it'll make the cut or not. I could see it making it, I could see it not. Like, it is a good engine. Yeah. Stolen Mutagens, which is my card. Stolen Mutagens is a cool card. I didn't do it justice. I forgot to show off the fucking mutagen artwork, and I've been beating myself up for it ever since. The mutagens look pretty neat. Yeah, I also have too much of a fear of social media or something like that. So I was pretty fast there. But yeah. It be like that sometimes. So with that being said, the option value on this card is really cool. Does it count as a double crime? No, it's a single crime. You play the crime once. These say crime, but they're like not. It's not playing the separate. It's not. It never says play a mutagen. It says pick a mutagen. It's like an extension. It's kind of weird. Like the question's legitimate with how the cards are tagged, but it was clarified that it was a single crime. I'm pretty sure. I'm like 90% sure on that one. So yeah, it kind of works like shaping nature. Sure. Yeah. So with that being said, this card is really interesting and kind of weird in that it has a lot of flexibility, but it also doesn't, right? Like you want to be playing this card with at least 3 Salamandra units. And for the red mutagen in particular, that's very limiting. Like this card is a lot more limiting than something like Attorney Joust. Because a lot of cards that you would want Attorney Joust will come down turn 1. Or very early in a round. So it's not like you're necessarily just constantly having that utility, or at least it'll be quite costly if you decide you want to stolen mutagens those cards. So I don't see the red as being nearly as good as I initially thought when I saw this card. I assumed you would mostly be picking red or blue. Surprisingly, green is a decent option from this card. Mostly thanks to salamander memes. And just other potential synergies with the card, as well as maybe protecting yourself poison cards. I do still think blue will be the primary use for this card, and this card will really come down to how good is Prophet 8. Prophet 8 is probably pretty good, but the problem I have with this card is that the self-poison deck of the new cards does not contain a spender. So you'll still have to be fitting in spenders, or just running like so many tributes to spend the coins that it seems impractical. So I'm not sure that you can use the coin generation, but probably you can. Probably coins are good, and probably this card is pretty good in this deck. I think this card is decent. The other issue that with this card though is that it's 5p. 5p cards in Syndicate I feel like are notoriously hard to fit in. Because the 4Ps are so good and because the gold cards tend to be very good. Like SY tends to be very top and bottom heavy. And so it's pretty tricky to be like, oh yeah, I want to run stolen mutagens. Like cards like Sewer Raiders, like for example, are often cut from things like Cash. Like Colomon's list did not have Sewer Raiders. Which I think is something that surprised quite a few people, and understandably so, because the cards are quite good. So, and from that sense, I could see this card not making it into the self-poison decks, but it definitely is strong as an option, and it has flexibility. Salamandra Abomination. This is the card that actually kind of like blew my mind a little bit, because when I saw this card revealed, I had no clue what the fuck the devs were smoking. And with every single reveal, this card actually started to make sense. And it's like legitimately a good card now. Yeah. This is actually really good support for self-poison, like unironically. Especially given that it's like you want to set up your Salamandra units, and then play stolen mutagens, and then you can use this as like setting up a Salamandra unit. And then by the time the adrenaline comes on, you're ready to play your stolen mutagens. Like the cards work well as a package. Like that works. This card, if you want to go full on like Exodia Salamander memes, this card purifies itself, so you don't need to go as all in on something like Rayla. This card can just stick to the board. If you have like 2 of them, they're just going to be big, and they're going to be good, and they're going to be way cheaper. This card has uses. With Gellert, you can just keep spending on Gellert, which will help you in turn get like more coins with Roland. Card's just kind of good. Like, it's 2 points a turn, and it's infinite poison targets. And it's not baseline bad. It's sticky with the Tribute 1, which if you wanted to run off the books could become Tribute 0. I'm unsold on off the books, but it's possible. It's not the most impossible leader to run. Next we have Salamandra Mage. Salamandra Mage is the card that doesn't quite fit as much in my opinion. It's an okay card. I actually think if it weren't next to all of the other cards from this expansion, this card would be pretty good in like an off-the-books sort of deck. Like if you're playing a deck with a lot of tributes, and this card itself has its tribute discounted by 1, this card is a lot of raw value. Like this card itself plays for 9 for 5 if you hit 3 units for 2. And then gains a coin every time you play a tribute after that. Which is quite good. Honestly, like, not a bad card, although the situation of having to have units next to each other is quite awkward, but it's at the level where if you only hit 2 units, it would not be like bad. So like this card has potential, but like what deck do you put it in is the bigger issue. Like I already talked about how 5Ps are hard, right? But this card is like not nearly as good as either of these two in like the new self-poisony stuff. It's not a card you'd put in Cash. It's not a card you would put in Congregate. So like where? It's like it's hard to see. So this is a card that I think like almost makes it in the sense that it just doesn't have a home yet. But may make it one day. I don't dislike this card. Failed Experiment. At first, I was kind of Pepe pointing Failed Experiment because this card seemed like at most an 8 for 5 and can potentially really suck. And can also totally fuck with things like Salamander. Because you have to poison them right away. But thanks to the location, I think this card is a lot better. This is still, in my opinion, primarily a round 1 card. But if you happen to pick one up in round 3, it's now usable. And that's huge. That's absolutely huge. That if you're playing a Salamander deck, Failed Experiment can work in round 3. I think that's a big buff to the card. That you can just transfer a poison off of it. Because otherwise is not so great. It's usable with Gellert. Yeah, I mean, also, obviously the Gellert reveal made it look better too, right? Because it can be an actual 9 for 5. Yeah. Like, I was getting there. I apologize. But to me, this is actually the bigger deal for Failed Experiment as to why I think this card is now good. Like 9 for 5 is not like amazing. I think with all the other 5Ps and all the other shit you want to play, it's still not clear to me that this actually makes the cut. But it's got a shot. I would say it's worse than Abomination. Abomination just seems good to me the more I think about it. Now we have Gellert. Gellert is very strong. Gellert is 5 for 7, profit 2, so if you remove it, it's already trading up. Profit 2 is generally better than 2 points. And also it's a bigger card, so bigger card generally good. Fee 1, poison an allied unit and boost it by 2. This card just generates value per turn with a cooldown 1. You get the fee right away, so it's actually even better. It's kind of like, you could argue it comes down at 8 for 7. So it really trades up with the removal in that sense. It can enable your self-poison cards with something like an Abomination. This can really, really go off. But you can also just poison anything and everything, whether it makes sense to or not. against decks that don't have poisons. And yeah, it'll be like it's an efficient engine. There's not a ton to say. And it's also the only spender. It's not really a spender because it has a cooldown of 1. Like, this doesn't really qualify as the spender that your deck uses, in my opinion. Like, probably you'll still need something like Philippa or maybe Sea Jackal, depending on how the deck is built. But yeah, it seems pretty good. Now we have Roland. Roland, I think, is one of the best cards of the set, kind of deceptively so. It's like up there with Gazarus. I don't remember which of the cards between Roland and Gazarus and Gaten I actually rated the highest. This card is just really efficient in a normal SY deck. This card is the only self-poison card where it's not like, oh, this could be good in the self-poison deck. This card could just be, like, good. I mean, you could argue that for Gellert, too. Gellert might just be, like, good, but Roland just kind of, like, is good. Like, Roland, you draw this round 1, it's, like, good. Like, even if you play even if you get stuck with it later and you just play a Trafficker on a unit, it's, like, not bad. Like Roland can get a lot of value in a round 1 scenario. And in self-poison, it gets better. You run more poisons. Like, card is nuts in self-poison. Big use of this card. It's a huge enabler of Salamander. Salamander can just get the coins back. And that's pretty good, given that this card, like, spends a bunch of coins and then poisons a bunch of units. Like, that's pretty pog synergy, if you ask me. So I think Roland is good. Next we have Salamandra Hideout. Salamandra Hideout is the second best card in the expansion. After this one. This one is still pretty Keck W. So yeah. Salamandra Hideout. Everything about this location is nuts. Like, this is the best location. Like, this just is the best location. Like, first of all, every single card that you can take has the potential to be good. Probably you're quite often going to want the Abomination. But it's hard to know. Like, the flexibility I can see genuinely being quite useful on the deploy. And none of the bronzes are bad. Order. Move a poison from an ally to another unit. Yeah? Yeah. This circumvents poison. Like, Maral is a pretty expensive card that basically does the same thing in terms of, like, dynamics, but this just, like, does it better. Like, being able to poison a card with Last Say is kind of massive. Like, a big upside of something like Heatwave is you just play a Heatwave and the thing is fucking dead. But now you can, like, play a Fist Tech and the thing is fucking dead. Or you can play a Salamander and the thing is fucking dead. Like, you can use this to poison the card that's not already poisoned that you want to die to Salamander. Like, raw value, a bronze plus a poison is just good for 8p. Like, good. Like, probably better than Fangs in terms of efficiency. And, like, Fangs is pretty premium as far as poison cards go. But, like, the fact that you also get to combo the poison is really nice. And it has resilience. You can, like, use you can just whip out your poison pretty much whenever you want. Like, this card is really strong. And yeah, these two cards are really big enablers of the next card, Salamander. And Salamander, when I saw Salamander, I kind of just fell in love. Salamander's fucking adorable. Salamander's just... Aw. Salamander's just a beautiful design. What I love about this card is that it doubles as a competitive card and a meme card. And it really feels like it excels at both. Like, the deck that it builds is unironically interesting. It's built off of synergies. It has a very unique game plan to it. It doesn't seem like it'll be unfair, but it does seem like legitimately it does some things aggressively well and has an argument to play it. And like, Salamander is like the card that really ties the deck all together. It's like, what's the big payoff for like doing all of this poison things? Like how do you really get value out of these cards that want a bunch of poisons? And it's like, bam, here's a card that can poison everything. And it like also benefits from having a bunch of Salamandric cards. And it can like actually make you money while poisoning everything, which is like pretty poggers. And you can also just Exodia Salamander. And if you manage to win round 1 and get last say, you can just like play and like maybe casually stick like a couple of dubious like Louisa, Cyanna, Azar, something TM. You can just like wipe the whole board, which is really, really funny. Like, this card, in my opinion, is way funnier than Beta can be. Because Beta can be was just like you played it and it did the thing, and the card sucked. Salamander is like, you play it and it does the thing and the card sucks, but you can also just play it if things go wrong. Or you could like play it in a real deck, and the card is good. And like, Salamander also is like, yeah, Salamander's pretty good. Salamander is my favorite card of the set, like, far and away. I have it rated as the 4th best after this card. Well, after this card, Salamandra Hideout, and Ivar. Ivar I have at 3rd just because this card is going to be fucking oppressive. And yeah, Ivar is pretty good against it. And Ivar is kind of going to be meta warping regardless of how much the card is actually played. Fallen Rayla. Fallen Rayla I actually see as kind of the oddball here. This card has 11 provisions, and it needs to stick for the entire game to actually be getting the value. And it's also Adrenaline 3, which is like a little late for playing this card. Potentially you want to be doing other things, like to set up your Salamander turn. But like, to me it's not even clear that this card is better than Louisa, with other combo options like Savola. Because Louisa needs to stick for 1 turn. This card needs to stick for the entire game. Like, a defender can potentially buy you that turn, like something like an Azar. But with Fallen Rayla, it's just not really clear how you get this card to permanently stick and, like, not trade down with Atal removal. It is really funny with Salamander OTK because it's just that much Veiled Strength. Like, the Tribute works on itself if it's in the Adrenaline range, which is cool. But to me, I view it as one more piece of a combo that's not necessary for the combo to work. And I think in general, combos should be as minimized as possible. And I think the real value of the combo is you get Roland on board, round 3. You get some Abominations on board. You play a Salamander. You play Moral. You play, like, Salamandra Hideout. You poison a bunch of threats. And you simultaneously control the board and get a lot of value. And the Fallen Rayla just feels like one piece that like, it feels like the most expendable piece in that picture. It's like, if it actually works, you basically get a 17 for 11, which is good. Like, I'm not gonna pretend that's not good, but it's like, it could be better for the amount of work you're putting in. It's not more efficient than Salamander in that scenario. Like, Salamander is still pulling the weight in any scenario where Fallen Rayla is actually good. So I kind of don't really rate Fallen Rayla. There's actually a chance this is worse than Arngod. Maybe Fallen Rayla is the worst Queen Pin Witcher. Although also she's not a Witcher, really. I don't know. Okay, that analogy's falling apart quickly. But yeah, that's my review of the set. I guess just to very quickly give my top 10. Number 1 is V. This card is going to get hot fixed. Number 2 is Salamandra Hideout. I don't think this card necessarily has to get hot fixed, but it is very, very strong. And it's also very cool, and just very interesting. Number 3 is Ivar. This card will be extra strong right away to counter out V. And I hope it also gets addressed. This to me is just kind of a lazy design. I don't want Nilfgaard to be more played because it gets more efficient tall removal. Like, I want there to be a more compelling reason to run Nilfgaard other than tall removal and Keck W. I can high roll you with random like card type effects. Number 4, I have Salamander. Salamander is just shockingly good in the self-poison deck when you actually like break it down. And the floor is not as low as you would think. If this card has to play as a Fangs, it's not good. But with a few Salamandra units, it can do the job. If you have like some of the synergy, it's like not too bad. Even if you don't have the Roland and you have to pay for it, it can potentially be worth paying for. Number 5, I have Keldar. Keldar just makes this deck. It seems like the only card that's really single-handedly keeping Northern Realms afloat. Number 6, I have the Adept, just because it's kind of a mandatory other piece of this combo. And the card is really good with the other enablers as well. Number 7, I have Gazarus, I'm pretty sure. This is where it starts getting like a little shakier, because this is the zone of like cards that I don't think actually build as good of decks, but are just really good. Like Gazarus, Gaten, and Hernkaduk. Like, it's sort of that zone. As well as Roland would round out my top 10 from this expansion in terms of power level. The Bear Witcher almost makes it. The Bear Witcher is really good, but it's not like that really good. Like, I just rate Skellige too little to put Bear Witcher in my top 10. This card is kind of nuts. This card, like, okay, sure. So yeah. That's kind of my breakdown. In terms of what I think will happen, Keck W on this. And then from there, we'll probably have a new meta. It doesn't really feel like too worth it to actually be predicting stuff. Yeah. No Arngod or Dire Bear. No Arngod or Dire Bear. Pepe smile. So yeah. How to counter the incoming V-Fest. Your best bet's Nilfgaard. Ideally with Lockdown if you really want to beat them. And Masquerade Ball. Syndicate has a chance. Like, I could see the self-poison deck being quite okay. If you get red coin with it, maybe it can happen with Syndicate, depending on how many Vs they're forced to play earlier. But like the other factions just feel like they don't have a chance to me. Most likely. Northern Realms with Shield Wall, maybe you can play enough ways to tall remove stuff and not completely compromise your deck to where it's like totally silly. But like the ST and the SK decks just seem completely prone to this strategy. So yeah, that's my breakdown. Appreciate y'all sticking around in the Twitch or watching when this goes on YouTube. And I'm tired, so I'm gonna stop recording. Peace. Fuck. Why is my taskbar in the way? Actually, peace. Wait, no, stop that. Yeah. Fuck. Okay, this is actually starting to trigger me. Man, I really am tired. Okay, I'm just gonna switch the scene and then move it here. And then sure, what do you mean it's still not? Okay, maybe if I max, oh, okay, there we go.